Good evening, citizens of Portsmouth and my colleagues on City Council, invited guests. I want to open up our public work session for today. And before we get started, I do want to make some acknowledgments. I would like to acknowledge Mr. James Wright, our deputy, who is sitting in for our interim city manager. Also, it is my honor and privilege to announce our president of the Senate, pro tempore, Senator L. Louise Lucas. Thank you for being with us, ma'am.
Thank you. Good evening.
Absolutely. I also want to introduce, or take a minute to introduce, my good friend, my favorite history teacher. And I think that I would dare say it's Virginia's favorite history teacher, Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander. Thank you, ma'am, for being here today. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Yes, sir. Mr. Barnes.
Present.
Mr. Hugel.
Present.
Mrs. Lucasberg.
Here.
Mr. Moody.
Here.
Mr. Tillage.
Here.
Dr. Whitaker.
Present.
Mayor Glover.
Here. Thank you, Madam Clerk. Mr. Wright, would you please have the floor? I mean, you have the floor, so if you would take over the meeting at this time.
Okay. Good evening, Senator Lucas,
Good evening.
Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of the City Council. Tonight we have a presentation on the Sugar Hill neighborhood, and with that, I'm going to pass it on to our city attorney to announce the speaker and the presentation.
Thank you. As you all recall, Dr. Whitaker, with consent of this council, asked for a historical perspective on Sugar Hill. As a result of that request, we were able to secure the historian that he suggested, which is Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander, who serves as the endowed professor of Virginia Black History and Culture at Norfolk State University. She has, I wish I could take claim to her work. She was able to hit the ground running without any direction. And I'm so happy to have her here to present this information to you all. And with that, I introduce you all to Dr. Newby Alexander. Please take the podium.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you so much.
Go ahead, sir.
Yes.
Before the presentation starts, I would like to just give a further context to why Dr. Newby Alexander is here. As we know, we were informed by a former city assessor that there had been an unusually high and aggressive use of tax liens by the city in obtaining properties there on Sugar Hill and Penner's Point. As a result of that, we were given updates by the city attorney of the transactions that took place. They were purely from a legal perspective, and there needed to be a historical context to how these transactions took place and the climate and the conditions of Portsmouth that were going on. And so that was the underlying reason why I requested Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander to come to give us a historical context to show that this is a pattern that has been common across many black communities across this country. And so I appreciate, I've read some of the report, and so looking forward to verifying some things that we know have occurred within our communities. So I just wanted to make sure that context was clear.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And also, before you begin, ma'am, I would like to introduce our other representative here who is representing
Senator Kane.
Senator Kane's office, Ms. Diane Kaufman. Thank you, ma'am, for being present as well.
Thank you.
And Dr. Newby Alexander, I know there's much more to your CV. If you would like to give your own introduction to those people who are listening here in the audience about your background, that would be good to give some context to it, please.
Thank you so much. So I am a native Norfolkian and grew up in Villa Heights in Norfolk part of the time, and in Winona the other part of the time. Graduated from Maury High School, the University of Virginia, and the College of William and Mary. I have focused, I would say, all of my professional life on Virginia, especially. and in particular on African American history. And I have, as a result, published some books that were of great concern to me. This was one of the major depots on the Underground Railroad. And I wanted people in this region to know your history and to know how complicated your history has always been. And so when I published Virginia Waterways and the Underground Railroad, it was just my first foray into publishing a book for the first time on Virginia and the Underground Railroad. We had more people leaving from Virginia than any other state. And as a result, I have a book contract which I'll be expanding that to looking at the entire nation. I've done a number of articles on that particular topic, variations, and one of the main people that I thought was very critical was a man by the name of Robert Irving, who adopted the name Sheridan Ford. And as a result of my research, one of the people who lived in the house on North Street, where he and his wife lived with her slaveholder in the basement with an earthen floor, they discovered his ancestors. And there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And they had no idea about their family's history, none whatsoever. And that's in part because trauma is very difficult to talk about to your family or to yourself, and you want to hide that trauma. And so I find that the history of this region in particular, but the history of African Americans has been especially about trauma and resilience. But then on the other side of that, the history of this nation has been about trauma and resilience. But we hide that history too many times, and that's why we call things American history or African American history. But if you really want to know about American history, you have to have it within the context of African American history. So as a result of that, I've been able to be a public speaker and have written a number of articles, some of which have won awards, such as the one on Sarah Garland Jones, who was the inspiration and the founder of Richmond Community Hospital, which is one of 2 Black-owned hospitals still surviving in the nation. And she was from Richmond. She was the first African-American woman to be licensed to practice medicine in Virginia, and the only woman at that time who practiced medicine, and she had a cadre of both white and black patients. And so it's telling this history that I think is critically important so that we can get away from fantasy and get into really talking about issues. And so as I looked at this particular topic, I brought that perspective with me. History takes no prisoners. It doesn't have sides, and it doesn't deal with politics. It just tells you the truth, however difficult that truth may be. And so I know I didn't talk about all the things. I've been on C-SPAN and a bunch of other documentaries, so my mouth is big. And in part, I think that's why I got contacted by NBC to do that program about one of the Congress people who actually was from Portsmouth. She's now in California. And so I did some research for them, looking at her history and her ancestors who were slaveholders, and really saw that her ancestors actually sold to the 3 people that they owned into the domestic slave trade. So it'd be interesting to see if we can find out who those descendants are. But that was on Lester Holt's program, which I understand got picked up quite a bit, and people were looking at that particular program because it dealt with power and leadership, and how many of these individuals who were powerful or had some money, because if you sold a person in the 1850s, in our dollars today, you sold them for anywhere between $65,000 and $100,000, one person. So that put you in a very wealthy category. And it's important to understand contextually what's going on. Of course, we're not responsible for our ancestors, but we are responsible for their legacies. So with that,
Thank you. Please proceed.
thank you. So, as you all know, a lot of recent attention has focused on the role that the city of Portsmouth has played in specifically harming the Sugar Hill community. There have been numerous articles published in the Virginian pilot on that particular topic. And at one point, it was actually a lovely suburban community. It was one of the few suburban communities in Hampton Roads for African Americans, in part because at the turn of the 20th century, there were a number of land development companies throughout the country, but especially in Hampton Roads or throughout Virginia and in all the cities that were trying to create these suburban communities because the focus was on creating a healthier living environment. Many of the cities were rat traps. The buildings were compacted. There was no sewage, no real light. And so people wanted to live in, if they could, in a cleaner environment, one that was not filled with everything that would take you out of this world by the time you were 50 years old. African Americans also began developing communities for each other. The difference was that most of the communities that African Americans created were with solely African American dollars. For many white suburban communities, there was a public-private partnership that often took place. You see a number of examples in Richmond where land was set aside or secured by the city, and the land developer, usually a private company, would create these suburban communities. Now, we know that Sugar Hill ended up being sandwiched between a busy highway system that connects the Norfolk's Midtown Tunnel with Portsmouth, as well as a major interstate system and roadway system. So it's a very busy area. But in addition to that, it's positioned right next to a thriving port authority. So taking a nod from the actions by California with Bruce's Beach, Portsmouth officials, I understand all of you decided, let's explore the possibility of looking into whether reparative justice can be applied in the case of Sugar Hill and the residents who live or who lived in that particular community, especially since so many of their homes were taken away from them through industrial development and aggressive taxation. Now, the Sugar Hill, and you can see this picture, and I'm going to show you this other picture, is located on Scotts Creek that flows into the western branch of the Elizabeth River. It's a neighborhood in which its proximity to the waterways made it a prime location initially for farming. Everyone traveled by waterways. That's why today we struggle with our roadways, because we used to only travel or primarily travel by water. It wasn't until the 1950s that we began to build a lot of tunnels and bridges. In fact, the Berkeley Bridge, what we call the downtown bridge and the downtown tunnel, that was originally to connect Norfolk with the Berkeley section, which was an independent community, and then it got annexed by Norfolk. And then, of course, the tunnel was designed to connect Norfolk and Portsmouth directly. And somebody came up with a bright idea, let's put a tunnel and a bridge with a lift together, and let us travel through that with a one-way lane. And so this whole region has evolved over time, and because of that evolution, we have as many cities that were pre-existing the 1950s have had to struggle with the expansion of communities, the expansion of populations, as well as the expansion of businesses that sometimes overran communities or were placed in proximity to communities. Like many African American communities in the nation, however, its fate was to ultimately be shut out of suburbia. And we would see that taking place, especially beginning with the New Deal and continuing on through the 1950s and 60s. Sugar Hill is a historic community intersected by Roberta and Quebec Streets and Marion Avenue. It's bounded on the west by the Martin Luther King Freeway, on the east by Scotts Creek, and it was a neighborhood that was originally a part of Pinner's Point. 87 parcels were eventually created as the area moved from being a farmland to a suburban neighborhood. Eventually, most of the area would be purchased by public-private partnerships that sought to seize most of the land for the development of part of the Midtown Tunnel and for the Port Authority. So aggressive was this effort to industrialize the neighborhood that by 1970, tax records show that 75 of the remaining lots were publicly owned for future development, and only 15 remained privately owned. Although little of the community remains today, it stands as a reminder to us how African American communities were often targeted, marginalized, and sometimes erased through the encroachment of industries, specifically in this community, railroads initially, and urban renewal with the consent and approval of local and state governments. What happened to the Sugar Hill neighborhood and the complicated public-private partnerships that eventually destroyed much of the community is really a common story in the 20th century. Numerous scholars and studies have concluded that America's racialized residential policies created a system of inequity that is self-perpetuating and often results in African Americans failing to build inheritable wealth through home ownership. The example of Sugar Hill illustrates also why African American wealth was harmed because of decisions made to use those neighborhoods as sites for public nuisances or zoned to facilitate industrial development. In addition, we had resource neglect, the location of heavy industries, highways, and other destructive entities adjacent to those neighborhoods, homes, schools, playgrounds, as a means that also were used to assess the value of those homes. Added to this was an ongoing neglect that African American communities would face at the forefront, including health risks and urban renewal. And urban renewal practices almost always resulted in the destruction of black businesses, neighborhoods, and schools, which perpetually destabilized families and their economic well-being, as well as a sense of community. Now, you all know that Councilman Whitaker proffered to you that perhaps Portsmouth should follow the lead of the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors and return the land to the original black owners. What is at issue are the 75 publicly owned parcels that the city is currently investigating as a possibility of returning to those owners, the previous owners. And I know that you all are having to deal with a lot of legal issues, or you're looking at these legal issues, including the Dillon Rule. Now, the neighborhood of Sugar Hill, as I said, this is a picture I took, a couple of pictures. It took me a while to figure out how to get back to the neighborhood. And if anybody has tried to get back there, please don't try to walk back there. You will get hurt because those trucks fly around those corners, they're zooming back and forth, and the road to Sugar Hill looks like an abandoned road that dead ends. And it actually does dead end, but not where you think it dead ends. And so it is a very difficult place to get to, and all the trucks and this is the road here leading back into that neighborhood. It is. Don't use your GPS, because your GPS will never find it. You have to figure out how to get back there. And so this, the position of the neighborhood today is not what it looked like 100 years ago. And certainly because of the desire to really have that area become industrialized and a part of the Port Authority, made it so that all of the key places were taken away and given to the Port Authority, given to the railroads, given to other entities, other private entities. And of course, what we had what we have today are just the remaining homes. Many of the homes, by the way, that you see there are in the typical Southern shotgun style homes. And if you know anything about shotgun style homes, the idea is you can stand at the front door, shoot a shotgun, and not hit anything. It goes straight out to the back door. That, of course, was to facilitate airflow. And that's why Southern homes, and usually it's working class people who would live in these shotgun homes. And so many of those types of homes still exist. Some of them are boarded up in the community, but some of them still exist in that community. Now, part of Sugar Hill was originally owned by a man named David Culpeper in the early 1800s. He established it as a farmland, cultivated the land, in stark contrast to what lay outside of his area, which was the growing town of Portsmouth. Up through the early 1860s, at the beginning of the Civil War, Portsmouth was 2 square miles. That was the city of Portsmouth. So if you go to, say, Emmanuel AME Church on North Street, that was actually just over the line into Norfolk County. And so when you think about it, Portsmouth has tremendously expanded. Of course, a lot of people don't realize that the outskirts of the Dismal Swamp actually came up as far as Frederick Boulevard, which is why you have all these low-lying areas here, a lot of peat moss and high water tables. And you have these little islands of land throughout the area. Now, after Culpeper died in 1825, he willed the land to his daughters. And reportedly, they sold a 45-acre plat on Scotts Creek to Edward. Oh, it doesn't want to go. Hang on just a second. To Edward and Lovey Ellett. Now, you will see their names spelled several different ways in the records. Sometimes they're listed as Elliot and sometimes Ellett. And that's because our wonderful census takers did just that. They phonetically spelled, they halfway listened, they halfway paid attention. But if you look at the records over a period of years, you see the pattern, you see the same ages, you see the same first name spellings. It's the last name sometimes that are pretty weird. And in this, it almost looks like it's Ellett or Elliot. It's like they're not sure which way to go. So they went both ways in that particular census record. And as you can see, Edward Elliot was listed as a mulatto, which means he was light-skinned, mixed, like many African Americans in this community. His wife and their children were all listed as black. And usually the census taker just eyeballed people to decide where they fell, whether, because mulatto doesn't have any meaning, not really, of half white and half black. That meaning did not exist in America. It was just somebody who was either lighter skinned or they weren't lighter skinned. And that's how they defined them. But they were a free black family, which is why they're in the census records. And this is 1840. And the Elliots left their farmland when they died to their daughters, Emmeline and Mary, and to their son, William. What's unclear is whether the Culpepers and their descendants sold additional lots to blacks following the Civil War, or whether the Elliots were responsible for selling those lots. All we know is that African Americans began moving into that area, and we see some evidence of that around the Civil War period, where people were establishing churches in that area. Usually when you see a church, it's because there was a hush harbor, which meant that this is an area where blacks were meeting collectively together without it being a formalized church. Outside the prying eyes of whites, because the law after Nat Turner's revolt said that African Americans could not meet together in a church without the presence of a black pastor or a white person watching over them. And so these hush harbors were very common. Of course, Portsmouth became an occupied city, as did Norfolk in 1862, so Norfolk in May of 1862 and Portsmouth about a few weeks after that. They became occupied cities. And so we know that there were blacks who started to live in this community. And I am going the wrong way. Okay. We also know that the Union Army helped African Americans to establish schools, and they call them generally contraband camps. This was before the passage, or the issuance, I should say, of the Emancipation Proclamation, which did not free anybody in occupied America. If you were an occupied city like Portsmouth and Norfolk, you were not freed. However, you did get certain rights, and there were subsequent acts passed by Congress that gave African Americans rights, and they were no longer seen as enslaved to their owners. And so all of this was happening in this important area. Many of the people were settling in this area. So the Union actually established a type of camp there, which suggests that there were more than just the Elliots. And I say suggest only because I haven't actually gone into all the Freedmen Bureau records to dive in and see whether or not that became an official camp. But we do know that a number of people were there. There was a lot of activity, and from that we would begin to see homes being built owned by African Americans. The black families listed in those areas in the 1870 census were listed all as farm laborers, tenant farmers, as well as farmers. And they included a whole host of people such as Dennis and Mary Evans, David and Georgiana Johnson, Caroline Bryant, William and Emmeline Thomas, John and Martha Easton. And I thought it was important to mention some of the names of these individuals who lived in that particular community. In 1886, and you can see in this picture, this railroad. This railroad was allowed to be built here by the city of Portsmouth, and it cut straight through the Elliots' land. So they had no say in the placement of where that railroad line went. And it seems that that railroad was, I would say, the first official foray or industrial foray into or near that particular community. Now, why that did that? I'm sorry. Okay. So this particular map, and I love this because it almost gives you a three-dimensional perspective of this area. It was drawn by somebody who was up in a hot air balloon. Something I would never do, but you can see the landscape, and you can see all of this was farmland, but for whatever reason they decided, here's Penner's Point, so they decided to put it right here instead of going up here, which is closer to where Port Norfolk would be. So there are questions about why there as opposed to other places. But the entire area would end up being the focal point for developers. And increasing numbers of people in the post-Civil War years were coming to this area, especially coming from eastern North Carolina, which is why you have a similar accent in Portsmouth that you have in eastern North Carolina, Emporia, because people were going back and forth, back and forth. And it wasn't just one way. They weren't just coming here. Sometimes they were going back to their original homes. And so there was this constant migration and flow of people in search of jobs. And of course, the whole Norfolk, Portsmouth harbor area was always very important. We have a tendency today of forgetting how important it was. On the eve of the American Revolution, the Norfolk Portsmouth Harbor was the third largest harbor in the country, the third largest harbor. And it continued to be one of the largest harbors by the 1840s and 50s, so much so that it became the primary departure point on the domestic slave trade, going to Charleston, Savannah, as well as to other areas like New Orleans. It was huge, even larger than Richmond. It wouldn't be until the 1850s that we would see the shift, but even when it shifted up to Richmond, because so many people were selling enslaved people because they could get a lot of money with that. And the tobacco farming would not yield as much as some of the other farming. People were incentivized to sell enslaved people, and Virginia did in large numbers. And because of that, this port area became increasingly more important by the 1840s and 50s. And because of that, Norfolk and Portsmouth and Virginia as a whole was looking to not only find a way to industrially connect these cities, but also to connect these railroad lines. So Norfolk had a railroad line ending right near that one or across the river, and Portsmouth wanted to have one so that they could have a ferry going back and forth, transporting people and goods. I know I'm getting into a lot of weeds here, and I apologize. It's the historian in me coming out. So we would have this land development company, the Norfolk Land Development Company, begin to purchase privately owned farmland, and they began to develop Penner's Point as a residential white middle-class community. This was a community that was advertised in newspapers and magazines throughout the country, where they would have a playground, they would have all kinds of amenities for this particular white community. And so that area was never touched. There was never an effort to develop any kind of industry in that area, even though it was kind of on the other side of all of these railroads. What was selected was the area that would be, or that was, Sugar Hill. Port Norfolk was an area that also became the terminus point for the Norfolk and Carolina rail line that connected passengers to the Norfolk ferry. And so there was an effort to bring visitors into the area. So Port Norfolk became that point where they were trying to bring people into the area so that they could enjoy the amenities. It was like a tourism site. While the other part of that Penner's Point we call Sugar Hill was actually more of the industrial. They wanted to develop that as the industrial side. Portsmouth businessman and Portsmouth City Councilman A.J. Phillips actually purchased land in Sugar Hill, Penner's Point, and other locations, so that by early 1900, he had formed a partnership with others to acquire 300 lots in Penner's Point from the Port Norfolk Land Company, as well as 2 large tracts of land in the heart of Sugar Hill. His 2 partners included T.J. Wool and H.L. Maynard. Interestingly, Wool was director and legal counsel to the Norfolk, Portsmouth, and Newport News Railway Company that focused on developing the lands in Pinners Point community and the Sugar Hill neighborhood in the 20th century. Wool directed and served as legal counsel to the Portsmouth Waterfront Land Company, the Pinners Point Company, the Pinners Point Home Company, the Western Branch Land Company, and the Airline Land Company. Wool also served as vice president and legal counsel to the Portsmouth Dime Savings Bank. Wool's partner was, as I said, was H.L. Maynard, president of the Land Development Company and president of the Portsmouth and Smithfield Railroad Company. That was a line that ran straight to Portsmouth. It was T.J. Wool who first secured the property of Emmeline Elliott Thomas. So that was her married name. This was one of the granddaughters of the original owners, the black owners. His railway company may have been the one involved in slicing through her land with tracks, impeding her farming. It was in 1894 that Emmeline Thomas placed her land in the holdings of Norman Cassell and with the firm of T.J. Wool, H.L. Maynard, and A.J. Phillips. Apparently, she had to sell her land to pay off her debts. According to scholars, the railroad and land development companies worked hand in hand to bring workers to the area using the railroads as their conduit. Their land development companies were then engaged in residential and industrial development. So the Sugar Hill and Pinners Point communities, as a result, became the focal point for all this land and industrial development. In other words, their location made them ground zero as the transportation, maritime, and industrial development for the region became the prime location. However, the decisions that were made appeared to have been guided by who was living in that location. African Americans who had little to no political voice in Virginia when decisions were made were often the victims of those decisions. You all know that there were a number of laws passed even before the new Virginia Constitution of 1902 was passed. There were efforts made to deprive African American men of their right to vote. And so by 1890, all of the African American men who were serving in the legislature, in the Virginia legislature, or in local government were all removed from office because of some of these discriminatory laws. But by 1902, all of them were removed from the voter registrations for a variety of reasons. So what drove the transformation of Sugar Hill and Pinners Point from farming to residential suburban life? Well, it was the railroads, as I've already mentioned. The Seaboard and Roanoke Railroad, the Portsmouth and Weldon Railroad. All of these began to merge together and became important and very powerful entities by the turn of the 20th century. The entrance of the Southern Railway to Pinners Point meant that it connected essentially all of the Atlantic seaboard right there to Pinners Point. And specifically, as that railroad line would go straight, it would basically go through the Elliott's land. Of course, that meant that that whole area of Sugar Hill would be directly impacted. Now, not surprisingly, the development, the industrial development of that whole area would also result in the land or the neighborhoods being transformed from what they wanted it to be, which was a suburban community, to a much more, I would say, workers' town community. And what I mean by that is you would see a lot of these examples throughout the country where an industry would basically buy up, with the help of that local government, they would buy up all the land, or that government would use eminent domain to seize the land and hand over that land to that industry. And they would create homes for their workers, and their workers, of course, would always pay a high rent rate to the company, and they would purchase from the store that was also owned by the company. And so you would start to see these railroad industries creating a similar type of workers' town in this Penner's Point, Sugar Hill community. And so it was really keeping all the resources and amenities of the city from having, the people from having access to all of them, so that all of their monies essentially came from and went back to those particular railroad companies. And let me just speed up a little bit to point this particular thing out. It would be by the time we get into the Great Depression that we would see some significant changes happen, which would involve government, specifically federal government, but also state and local governments. And that would be the creation of the Federal Home Loan Bank System. And what would come out of that is the Homeowners Loan Corporation, also called HOLC. And before I get into that, I just wanted to point out that you can see these areas here that are specifically redlined, although as we go up to Penner's Point, these are not as much redlined, but later would become redlined. This was in 1930. And I'll explain what redlining means. So this corporation, by the time it established itself and began to establish certain rules and regulations by 1940, it would start determining what was considered a risky neighborhood to invest in and not give loans to, homeowners loans for home improvements and so forth, and which ones were. And of course, if you were in the blue zone, you got everything. If you were in the red zone, you got nothing. And this would also impact the resources that the city would provide. It would impact the value that your homes had, so you would not have that inheritable wealth that you could pass down, and it would make you also more likely to sell your property because you could not expand, you could not improve, you didn't have resources available to you, and that meant that a lot of the property would either be absorbed through eminent domain or sold to companies that already want to encroach into your territory. And of course, this area, this Port Norfolk area, you can see here's the railroad track. So you can really see this is where the Ellet's land was. This is where Sugar Hill is. And of course, the rest of Penner's Point that was inhabited predominantly by African Americans, that area was also redlined. In one of the most important studies on this particular topic by Richard Rothstein, entitled The Color of Law, it was published in 2017, and the secondary title of that book is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. He said that housing discrimination was not just the result of private and municipal actions. Rather, the federal government played a major role in creating a national pattern of housing discrimination. In 1938, for example, the Federal National, I want to make sure I hit the right button here. The Federal National Mortgage Association, which was also formed, now called Fannie Mae, bought mortgages from lenders to encourage more home lending. And the Homeowners Loan Association then began to impact what they did. And then, of course, you had the Federal Housing Administration that was created in 1949 that was supposed to ensure that loans made to banks and other private lenders promoted home building, but primarily to whites only. In fact, that Homeowners Loan Association worked very closely with the Realtor Association, which was all white, to downgrade the value of black homes, and this is all documented by scholars. There are at least 30 books out now that detail out all of this information. And all this started in the late 1930s and 1940s and reached a height by the 1950s and 60s. So what they did was they made it so that blacks didn't have too many alternatives. They stayed in poor neighborhoods or they stayed in crumbling cities. Meanwhile, the white population was encouraged to build wealth through the creation of these other communities. And I wanted to show you some of how the Homeowners Loan Association graded these areas. And of course, Sugar Hill was redlined and it was in the hazardous. So this was deemed a hazardous community. And that's an important designation because that meant that the people of that community immediately lost most of the home value. It also meant that the individuals had a difficult time not only building wealth, but moving to other locations. And it also meant that they had a higher rate of health issues in those communities because of a lack of resources that were put in there. And I'm just going to zip through this. I think you all have copies of the PowerPoint. Again, here is the Sugar Hill community. By the time we get into the late 1940s, many of the apartment buildings that were being constructed by the railroad company and later by the not port authority, but areas that were developing maritime industry, these apartments were renting for $35 to $55 per month per unit, which was actually very high at that time. We don't think of it as high, but for those of you who are about my age, and I'm 65, you know that in 1970, for example, a middle to actually upper middle class income was $20,000. That was the beginning of an upper middle class income in 1970. So imagine you were paying that much per month for rental, and you were already getting paid a small amount of money. It would be in the 1950s that we would see some of the actions of not just these private companies, not just the city of Portsmouth, but also the state. Because, the Norfolk port, which includes the Portsmouth side, was designated by King Charles back in the 17th century to be the Port of Virginia. It doesn't matter what Richmond says. It was designated down here to be the Port of Virginia. And it's because of our waterways, because of our deep natural ports, because this area was 7 miles from the Atlantic Ocean. We were at the opening of the Chesapeake Bay. All the rivers, like a superhighway, flowed into where we are, which is why we're called the Hampton Roads, by the way. Most people around here don't know that, because the waters were our roads. And so that superhighway, that hub called the Hampton Roads, is between Hampton and Norfolk. That's the Hampton Roads. It is at least 300 feet deep in that area, which is why you'd be stupid to get in a little boat and try to go across that waterway. There are people who do that and they end up in the water because the waters are rough because they're so deep. And so the further inland you go to the Norfolk Harbor, it was critical because you were just outside of the rough seas. You were just outside of all of the major storms that will go through. You can be in Norfolk and it's raining, go across the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel and you're in snow in Newport News or Hampton. It's because this area just gets that Gulf Stream. that keeps the weather moderate around here, and that was why this was such an important port area. But the Sugar Hill community was seen, because of its proximity to Norfolk, it was seen as a place where they were going to develop a port authority. But in order to do that, you had to also develop a transportation system that would easily connect that city called Norfolk, which was almost an island, to the rest of the continent. And so we would see, I'm sorry, I went backwards. We would see a highway system that would connect this important, what was essentially a small section of the city. It would connect it to this huge important industry. I want to show you this other picture. So the demographics of Sugar Hill meant that this area was not seen as something that would provide a lot of pushback, because the people, for the most part, still couldn't vote. There was, Norfolk had this blank ballot system. It was really interesting. In the 1960s, if you wanted to register to vote, the registrar would show you what you needed to fill out. Take that form back and then hand you a blank piece of paper and tell you to fill it out if you were black. So you had to memorize what you were supposed to, everything you were supposed to fill out. That's how Norfolk officials kept people from voting. And of course, Portsmouth followed that same pattern. And so a lot of people couldn't vote, and then of course they were also poorer. And so you're talking about people without a political or an economic voice. So when the state decided that the best place, and I'm just going to go past this, that the best place to create a midtown tunnel to connect Norfolk and Portsmouth, the midtown tunnel was designed not to be a traffic by private citizens, but rather it was actually designed to be for commercial travel primarily. And that's why its proximity was so important, because it was already going to be pointed directly at this area that was being industrialized. Just like in Norfolk, a lot of people who live in the former Atlantic City, what they call Atlantic City. So if you go on the other side of the Midtown Tunnel, those neighborhoods that you come, that used to be part of Atlantic City. And used to be one of the most diverse communities in all of Hampton Roads. And then the Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority moved out all the black people. And the little bit that remains is predominantly white in that neighborhood. And so that was done with intentionality. You can see it in the records. They intentionally targeted certain areas. And that was in the 1940s. And so, and 50s. And so it would be in the 1950s that we would see the city and the state decide they were going to have the Midtown Tunnel placed there, which meant that they needed more land. Not just land for the tunnel, but land around the tunnel as well, to create almost a hole around the tunnel. And you would begin to see, using the Federal Highway Act of 1956, that there would be this connection. We would also see 264 created, which was built straight through a lot of black neighborhoods in Portsmouth, and still doesn't have any sound barriers. For the most part, all the way from the tunnel to Bowers Hill. Same thing is true in Norfolk. Going straight through the black communities, no sound barriers. So we would see that the planners of the interstate as well as the tunnel were using eminent domain to take a lot of the homes, the remaining homes that were there. The construction, you can see a correlation in this previous map between where the highway was located. Let me go back to this larger map. You can see where the highway is located and where many of the black homes or black communities were located. So let me just zoom up. I promise you I am almost done. There are a lot of complicated things that began to happen after the Midtown Tunnel was built. You would see in 1963, for example, the City Council enacting an ordinance that would appropriate monies to purchase more and more property. You would see a landfill created to go along with the construction of the Midtown Tunnel. You would see the city appropriate additional funds to purchase more and more properties in Penner's Point, which would directly impact the properties in Sugar Hill. And a few months later, you would see 7 parcels of property being purchased for vacant lots because people were leaving that community as more and more of their community was being taken over and industrialized. You would also see something, and I wanted to just get to this point. You would also see something that was extraordinary that would happen. The Public Works Department in the 60s actually admitted to the City Council that they were using Sugar Hill as a dumping ground for toxic waste. They were dumping, they were taking materials that were burned in the city incinerator, and they were taking it over to Scotts Creek and to the community and dumping that into the community. Hot tin cans were being dumped so you could see it still smoldering, and there were lots of reports about that. Depositing non-solid materials that they were using to clean streets, and they would take it over to Sugar Hill and dump it in that area. You would also see a private company, the Columbian Real Estate Corporation. They would convey 6 parcels of land that they own to the city of Portsmouth for further development. And these are just some documents showing in 1975 what the City Council was doing in terms of directing, using eminent domain, directing the purchasing of land. And I've included that you can read. And then by 1975, and this is a recent picture, so you can see a lot of vacant lots. One of the 2 houses here is actually boarded up, so there's really only one home open there. And they're right beside the Martin Luther King Freeway that's taking you to the Midtown Tunnel. Members of City Council approved $31,000 for capital improvement that would further develop this area as an industrial site for the Virginia Port Authority and acquiring more and more land in this area. So by the time we got to the 60s and 70s, it was a foregone conclusion that the city was all in helping to develop this area as part of the Port Authority and taking as much land as possible to facilitate this. And so what I tried to do was look at all of the ways in which land was transferred, whether it was through eminent domain, through purchasing of the property, offering, whatever the base amount was for the property, or seizing the property because of unpaid taxes, or other issues having to do with inheritance. Because for those of you who inherited property, you and your siblings, or everybody in your family, most families abandon those properties because it becomes a very complicated thing to sell. Now, where do we go from here? So I threw out a few recommendations. I believe personally in reparative justice. If you've just chopped off my legs and you've given me a wheelchair, but then I've got to somehow make it up a flight of stairs by myself. There's a problem, because you've injured me to the point that I can no longer live at the same level as I could before. And so reparative justice really requires that we go back. No, we weren't responsible for what our ancestors did. But we should look and go back if we want a society that is fair, that is just, that lives up to these ideals that we, like to trumpet all the time. Then you have to engage in reparative justice. And that means go back and repair some of the practices that were harmful to communities of color, especially African American communities. Policies that impacted housing, that impacted inheritable wealth, that impacted people's health and well-being, that impacted their economic empowerment and their generational perspective. Because these things, whether or not we talk about them, they have a tremendous impact on people. Sociologists and psychologists have done a plethora of studies about this. So some solutions: municipal investment in those areas that were unfairly harmed by past discriminatory policies, especially forcing blacks to vacate their homes. Redressing these ongoing issues associated with the location of public nuisances next to or within African American communities, and understanding that they have an ongoing and generational health impact on people. In Hampton Roads, the majority of our children have asthma. The majority, I don't mean 51%, I mean 70% have asthma. Some of them grow out of it and some of them just leave, and then the asthma leaves because they're positioned near a lot of toxic zones. And then municipal advocacy. I'm a big advocate of creating more or building more sound and environmental barriers along the highways, because what that does is it keeps a lot of those fumes from going out. It keeps a lot of the noise from going out into the communities, and we have a plethora of those along our Western Freeway, but we have zip, except for in one tiny little area on 264 in Portsmouth. And the city doesn't have to pay for it. According to the Virginia law or the transportation law, you can advocate for, if it's a new highway or a rebuilt highway, it comes automatically, but you can actually advocate for something like that. And so those are just a few recommendations I have, and I am sorry I took so much time. I thank you for your attention, and I'm open to any questions or comments.
Questions? Dr. Whitaker, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Newby Alexander. The perpetrators of the crime that occurred and the destruction of Sugar Hill, they're all in this room, because we have at the federal level Senator Kane's representative. We have at the state level our senior Senator Lucas, and we have the city council. And so the question becomes what we're going to do about it. And the reason that you were asked to come and present is to show that what happened at Sugar Hill was intentional, that it was by design. And there's no need for us to try to hide behind the Dillon rule, but we need to put in place policies to restore. And I think that for us to have a majority black city council, a black city attorney, we have the most senior person in the state legislature, Senator Lucas, is black, and we not correct this, I think it's a disgrace to our heritage. I'm not expecting others to do, but we have the power to do it. And there was another slide just before this one that I want to ask you a question about, and the one before this one. Where you have in 2005, we have the Greater Portsmouth Development Corporation, another private public entity now showing up, just like it did a few 50, 70 years before under another entity. Does it appear that that was a common practice, that you have these public-private organizations, they're using the same law firms, the same real estate companies that are deprived in these neighborhoods, and you have city involvement?
Yes, that actually is a pattern throughout America. And you see, especially in cities, you see this public-private partnership form. In part, like Norfolk Redevelopment Housing Authority had a similar type of private-public partnership. So the foundation side of it is able to do things that, of course, the public entity could not do. And sometimes that was used to the harm of some communities. Other times it was used to get grants and other kinds of donations. But you would see that was usually a strategy that most cities began adopting sometime around the 1970s. That you would see these public-private partnership things emerge. Prior to that, you simply had, like I showed you with some of these the land company, you would have that, but it wasn't formalized, as you would see with these redevelopment companies that were an arm of the city.
So what we're seeing here is, what you're saying is a actual formalization,
Yes.
legal entity being put together that's just a perpetuation of what was happening years ago with the railroad, the real estate companies, the law firms, what they were acting independently
Right.
along with the city. And then you see it capsulized here
Yes.
with these organizations.
And Norfolk's side of that, the Norfolk Redevelopment Housing Authority, that was created in 1945. So in the years right after the Second World War, you would start to see some cities creating organizations like that, and they would be tasked with urban renewal. Most African Americans in this region called it Negro removal. And it's because they often targeted the black communities that were already neglected with promises that they would, fix those entities, but in fact they actually just wiped them out. Hampton, for example. Downtown Hampton was the Grand Contraband Camp. I don't know if you all know that. And in the 1980s, I think, Hampton wiped out that community. That was the business district of the black community. One of the first black-owned banks was right there in downtown Hampton that was helping to promote land development and community development and helping people get mortgages and so forth. And it was Brown Savings Bank, and he moved his bank to Norfolk. The white banks imitated the things that he was doing. He was originally from Philadelphia, and he was brought to this area by Huntington, who owned the shipyard over there in Newport News, to help all the black shipyard workers have a safe place to put their money and to help with wealth expansion and development. But that whole area got wiped out as well, and they still haven't rebuilt that area that used to be dominated by African Americans. So that was using these sort of redevelopment corporations with a lot of cities, did a lot of harm ultimately, because they were guided by a lot of racialized policies, and the redlining was one of the worst racialized policies that the federal government put in place. and the states and localities followed those policies. So I hope I actually addressed your question.
Yes, thank you.
One comment.
Vice Mayor Lucasberg.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Alexander Newby, for the presentation. I feel like I'm back in your class from 2016, and a test will come later. But I think this is good information that we would have never gotten hadn't we pushed to get this point. And what we were told was that it would take years and years and time and efforts and money and resources to be able to go back and to try any of the reparative justice resolutions or solutions that you recommended for us. But I think it is worth having a conversation to see, what we could begin to tackle, on the list, to begin to look at, some policies, some barriers on interstates, and advocate as council, as municipal government in areas where we can be effective. And I guess our city attorney, the information that you gave to us was that, pretty much because it's a legal matter of what happened, there wouldn't be much that we could do. But now hearing the presentation and it's broadcast to the community for all of us to see, where can we go from here?
Well, what I explained, you will recall that initially the request was whether we could give the property back. And the Dillon rule does not allow a locality to act without the full authority of the General Assembly to do so. And because that provision is not in our code, our Virginia code, then we can't do that. Now, what Dr. Newby Alexander has suggested is something very different.
Right.
She is talking about advocacy, she's talking about community involvement and continuing the discussion. And so what council needs to do at this point is continue to have the conversation and decide where you all want to go. Because I think what has been put forth is very different from what has been suggested. And so that, I think, is the difference between the advice given and where we are today.
Councilman Moody, sir, you have the floor.
Well, we heard from our city attorney what city council can't do. What can the state do? I think that would be the next legal authority, legislative authority to see what the General Assembly can do. Not going to get an answer tonight, but I think that's obviously.
And since
But,
I'm the only member of the General Assembly here, of course, I'd have to consult with our council as well. Before I make any pronouncements about what we can do. But I do want to say that as Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander was going through her presentation, I had a flashback to my days as a very young girl visiting my grandparents in Penner's Point. And as I recall, there was no indoor plumbing. So I tried not to stay at grandparents' house very long. But I do recall as a kid visiting my grandparents in Penner's Point. So if you find the Dockery's on the list over there, please let me know.
I will.
Well, to follow up on the state question, I would think that at the end of the day, it would be something that would be litigated in the courts. If some people who have standing want to pursue it.
Well, I would tend to agree with you, but again, I'm not going to make any
Yeah.
statements. And I noticed that two of the people who were part of the formation of the entities in Portsmouth were U.S. Senator Spong and State Senator Moody. Neither of whom are still here. But maybe there's something that can be done to stop the ongoing proliferation of what happened 80 plus years ago. And you see now that there's an emergence of that same kind of thing happening again. I think what you need to do is try to stop that in its tracks so that we don't repeat our history, because it appears very clearly that that's the direction that we're headed in.
Councilman Hugo, sir, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. Appreciate the history lesson tonight. Dr. Newby Alexander, it was valuable to see the landscape from another set of eyes. I really appreciate your recommendation and kind of coming at this from the direction that you came at it. I think the city attorney's been clear that if we look backward and try to solve this by putting land back in the hands of people that maybe lost their land in a variety of ways, that gets messy in a hurry. But more importantly, it's not within our authority to do that. On the other hand, there are policies that are local policies, as well as policies at the state level, at the federal level, that contributed to the issues that you've outlined here, that I think if we look at those and turn around and look forward, what are the policies that cause those issues that are within our authority to either create or modify in order to ensure that from this point forward, our neighbors aren't being impacted in the way that these neighbors were. And so I think rather than just pushing the problem to the state or pushing the problem to the feds, it is incumbent on us to take a look at the policies that are ours on city council to wrestle with and figure out if there are things that we can do that haven't been done to resolve the equity issues. And it's interesting, the red line drawing that you put up there wasn't just Sugar Hill. I mean, our innovation district was in the red line. Pieces of our downtown and Old Town were in the red line. So there are huge pieces of Portsmouth that were affected by those red line criteria, not just Sugar Hill. And so going back and fixing the land issue in Sugar Hill doesn't really solve the broader issue across Portsmouth and more importantly, the broader issue across all of Virginia. You listed several other communities in Virginia that were similarly impacted by the same federal and state policies and so this is a much bigger problem than just Sugar Hill. It would be nice if that problem was as clean as the beach problem in California, where there was one family. It's not that clean, but I think looking forward, we can take a look at the policies that perpetuate these issues, or at least put us in a position to perpetuate the issues, and see if there are changes that we can make to those policies that are within our authority to do something about. So I appreciate that viewpoint.
Dr. Whitaker, sir, you have the floor.
I find it interesting that from both the state perspective and from council, I'm hearing this, we have to look forward, we can't look back. When the first point that's up there is municipal investment for those unfairly impacted. That's not a forward-only look.
No, that's correct.
That's looking back as well. Now, the city attorneys, I keep hearing this discussion about the city doesn't have the authority to do it. I don't know exactly what that means. Does that mean that would be something that we would have to petition the state to get authority to do something? Because just to say we don't have authority to do it, that doesn't mean we can't get authority to do it.
That is correct.
Right. And so I think we need to attack this as aggressively as those properties were taken. And for you all to keep sitting here talking about we're going to we can't go back, we're going to move forward. I see people sitting in here who have been impacted in the past by it. And so you're going to tell them, we're going to put sound barriers up. We're going to make sure that toxic waste isn't poured into your communities. Well, we should do that. But at the same time, there needs to be some type of reparation, restoring of those who have been unfairly impacted. by intentional discriminatory policies. And I know some of you are hiding behind your politics on this, and you're also trying to ignore the issue. But we have the power if we want to, because if this were a white community and that happened to, this would have been solved yesterday. And all this discussion about what we can and can't do wouldn't be going on. And so I'm not interested in just looking back and looking. I'm interested in looking back and looking forward. And I think we need to, if we're really committed to doing it, is we need to look at putting policies in place for us to do that, and not just talk all of this dream stuff that's not going to impact folks who have been harmed.
Thank you, sir. Councilman Moody, sir, you have the floor.
Well, to follow up on my colleague, Councilman Hugel's comment about redlining and such, and what, we can do something about today and tomorrow. As I recall, I think redlining was outlawed in 1968 by the Fair Housing Act, so that we know that's illegal nationwide. But I guess my question to the city attorney, and maybe you can do this in the report back, obviously you can't deliver it tonight, but we need to look and see what practices, what ordinances that we currently have in place that would prevent that happening in the future. And with that said, I would like to think you'll find nothing, but we don't know that.
Right.
So you're the legal authority.
Exactly.
And so let me just, if I could just recap what you're asking of us to do, is to look to see if there are any laws or policies on the books currently that would continue to foster the kind of historical segregation, racism impact that's been described here. If
I think there are.
And even, you can have a federal law on the books, but is it being violated locally?
Well,
So-
I would ask that we be limited to what our local government has, because that would make it an extremely expansive
But we have to follow
search.
that.
Sure, yeah,
So-
right.
Mr. Mayor, can I follow it now that the city attorney is back in? Can I?
Oh, absolutely, sir. You have the floor.
Yes, sir.
Attorney Grammer, you left the room when I raised this issue. The comments that are being made about what the city can't do because we don't have authority, just because we don't have the authority, that doesn't mean we can't get the authority from the state.
Right.
And so I believe that it's not an either or. Either we look forward or we don't. I think we need to look forward as well as look back. And so in that vein, we need to find out what the procedures would be for us to get that authority. And for you all to keep limiting this to the conversation of giving the land back to the people as the only way of reaching back, there are also other ways and other things that could be done other than just giving land back. That was just an initial comment. And so I would be interested with looking at what procedurally needs to be done for a locality to have that type of authority to redress the type of harm that we've seen here.
Okay, it would wholly depend on what you are looking to do to
Right.
redress it.
Right.
And so if you all are going to have to make a decision
Right.
in order for me to move forward in that research, because I would be pulling from, I wouldn't have any direction. So I think what needs to happen is there further discussion that you all need to have.
Well, I think
what
there
council
I
wants
think
to
there'll
do.
be a number of options as far as redressing past harm that would be examined, and that would be for you to come back with giving us a direction. But if you're talking about you want us to specifically state,
Yes.
then that's a conversation we definitely.
Right.
But what I'm saying is that let's not close that conversation, because I keep hearing we're not looking back, we're looking forward. And I'm saying let's look back and see what policies we need to get in place at the state level to give us authority to reach back. And that's not going to happen tonight.
Right, okay,
Yeah,
okay.
that's not gonna
Fair
happen
enough. And
tonight.
that has to
Yeah.
be a direction. I want to be very clear because I don't create the policy.
Right, right.
I simply look up the law and I need facts to do that.
Right.
So you all need to, as a council, decide what avenue you're going to take and then give me that direction.
Right.
And then we'll be happy to move
Yeah, and
forward.
I
hear
think,
what you're saying.
I think what you're seeing tonight is
Yeah.
that we've gotten quite a bit of facts of how there was intentional harm perpetrated by the federal, state, and local. And so now, what do we need to get put in place
Yeah.
as a locality to address that?
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
I think the
Councilman
senator
Barnes.
wanted to comment on that, so I'll let her.
No, I did, because I'm saying, in as much as we are Dillon Road State, some of the policies that might need to be reversed may come as a result of you having to maybe ask the General Assembly to do something so that you can, so it opens a door for you to do whatever you need to do. And so, to that extent, I'm open to supporting any legislation that this council decide is necessary to undo some of the policies that will continue to perpetuate what we're seeing. Because based on the information we received tonight, it doesn't appear to me that there is an end to what can happen.
Well, are you willing to look at policies not only to not perpetuate, but also to correct past harm?
I'll do whatever the
Okay.
council decides. All you have
Okay.
to do is give me a resolution.
Okay.
That's how I operate. If you give me a resolution, I go forward with whatever you ask.
Councilman Barnes.
So a lot of what I was saying already been discussed by the time it got to me. I just had one question. From the presentation, it looked like some things as far as this property has been done, aside from this year, up until 2013.
Yes, yes, with a final transference of some properties. And most of that is to solidify the expansion of the Port Authority. So that whole container yard that actually reaches close, very close to Sugar Hill, that was, I think, the last piece that was added. I want to say, as you all are talking about this, something I didn't actually put in my recommendations was that for the community itself, you know, I started off by talking about how hard it is to get into the community, how unsafe it is to get into the community. I would love for City Council to look at another access point, because, you know, the community has one way to get in and out, and it's unsafe. And the Scotts Creek that's there is polluted, and it's you can't really see it, and that has taken away value to those homes that are located in that, because, you know, waterfront property is premium around here, and when you have a polluted and inaccessible waterway, it devalues people's properties. And so that's something I think that is within the power of the city to take a look at. And I know that the EPA has all kinds of money right now that can help with a lot of pollution cleanup.
That is very true.
Well, I'm hoping that this is not the last time that this council discussed this. Actually, I'm hoping that we kind of go in the direction of talking about this and trying to get some redress to this issue very soon. Those families, I'm pretty sure some of them in the room now deserve that, at the very least, from this council. And we can correct some of the things from the past and make sure we make this right for them.
I know what a shotgun house looks like. I hope there are none left over there.
There are.
Councilman Tillage, sir, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Newby Alexander, for that presentation. It was a really good history lesson. I learned a lot that I thought I knew, you actually corrected a lot of that. You and I had a conversation at NSU Earth Day a couple months ago. And one thing I found fascinating, you provided it in the presentation, was healthcare disparities.
Oh, yeah.
Related to redlining and how all that affects poverty, it shows the correlation between poverty and lack of resources
Determinants of
to
health,
diseases
determinants, everything.
and different natures. And so, addressing Councilman Hugel's point, as you mentioned in your presentation, there's things that we can do now to address these issues. And healthcare disparity has been something that I've been pushing for and advocating for quite a while. And as a council, I'm sure we'll address those hopefully very soon. But I think that's also a way of helping to correct. You also made mention a few minutes ago with the EPA, cleaning up those sites. And a lot of our areas that were redlined were brownfield sites, and we have those all across the city. And so there's ways now with the federal government to get money to come clean up these areas. So number one, increase health, but also increase land value. But then also to Attorney Grant Williams' point and Senator Lucas's point, I think it starts with council looking at our policies first, which was one of your recommendations, was for us to look at our policies, because we can't ask the state for something that we don't know ourselves.
That's right.
So I would love to see this council to examine what currently exists in Portsmouth and what it is that we need to ask the state or the federal government to do, if anything. But I think continuing this conversation amongst ourselves to know exactly what we want, because we can't give the attorney or Senator Lucas or our federal delegation any direction if we don't know what our own direction is. But I do thank you for this great presentation.
And again, I reiterate my statement that all I need is a majority of the council members to give me a resolution telling me specifically what it is you want. And I'll go forward with that.
Thank you, ma'am. So I have a couple of thoughts that I want to share. And also, before I share my final thought, I would like to ask a question. In listening to this, certainly the history, as you said, is complicated. And it is the history, and it is what we have. And so today, as we sit here, I think one of the things I've taken away from it is it's something we all need to embrace in terms of understanding to the best of our ability as we sit here today. What I had a question is for the attorney, in our documentation, because we understand based on, you gave us a lot of information to peruse, and I took a lot of time to look over this information. One of the things that come to my mind, because there are several components here of this whole process, right, of how we may get to some type of resolution to move forward. I think when we analyze the information, my question for you is, in some of the information you gave, you said, stated, the Dillon Rule precludes the city of Portsmouth from exercising remedial acts that were implemented. Certainly you gave us the example of the Manhattan Beach in California issue, which we know wholly and totally wasn't exactly what we have here. And then it says there is no state legislative authority afforded to municipalities and government to transfer property back to property owners or their heirs to remedy prior claims of discrimination by municipal governments in the acquisition of these properties. Additionally, the question of whether an action by local government is discriminatory is a fact-finding role for a court. And I'm asking that question because with that understanding, where's the latitude there? Where is there latitude? Perhaps that's not an answer right now, but is there latitude? Because this particular description of what the legal implication is, it's really not up to a city council. So help me understand, where's the latitude there? Is there? I mean, because I know I've heard in law things are black and white, a lot of things, so this body needs to understand.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I think what you're asking me is part of what's been discussed here, which is, and I think it started out with Dr. Whitaker's first remark, which was we initially looked at it from the point of giving property back under the example of Bruce Beach. That was our first sort of look into this. And there were 5 report backs on this. This dates back to March of 2023.
Yes.
What I gave you last night was not new information.
That's
what
right.
I gave you were all the report backs so that you were prepared for this presentation.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that so that you all would have the full breadth of all the issues here. So each of you have isolated what I think are important things to consider as we move forward. Looking at redressing the past, limitations on what our authority is, talking about what is or isn't in our own books. Where can we go with health? What can we do right now? All of you all have the answer right in front of you. It's a large and enormous amount of issues that you can deal with. You can deal with them as a policy matter, which doesn't involve the legislature. You can deal with them as a legal matter, which involves the legislature, but you're going to have a resolution before she does anything.
Can't move until I get it.
All of that stems off of one concept. You all need to get together and decide which areas and priorities you have, if any, and and those priorities will then dictate what issues are going to be the ones we move forward on, and we take bite by bite, or we do nothing. But that falls on you all. And this was a sort of an overview of all the issues that are presented. And I'm here to tell you, it cannot be the legal department that solves this problem. It's not going to happen with our small department. And I'll tell you, I've got some kick-ass lawyers in my office. We do major things every day.
Right.
Okay? 2 of them are here today, my deputies. And I don't want to say that we aren't capable, because we are. But these are issues that are going to involve the historians in our community. They're going to involve the health specialists in our communities. They're going to involve the land use people in our communities. They're going to involve lots of different aspects beyond the folks in this room and at this table, and certainly my office. And so what I'm going to ask you all to do in answer to the question is get together and figure out the priorities of where this is going and give us direction, and we will move forward.
So thank you, ma'am. And one other thing I want to say to that. So in that spirit, when I was doing some additional research, St. Louis, Missouri did something very similar. And so I placed a call to the mayor of St. Louis, who's a good friend. So I think as we go forward, I would just like to say that, right now, I think we have an abundance of hope and faith in the leadership. I think we have heard from everyone. Certainly, Dr. Newby Alexander, your information has been invaluable. It has created more desire. And I think we can perhaps collectively together come together in the right spirit, right, to heal our community, but more importantly, to provide a pathway to ensuring that this kind of thing never happens again. And I think that is, I'm not speaking for anyone in council, but if I had to pick up a charge and something that I thought would be helpful and hopeful to our future, that is where I would like it to begin. So with that, I just want you to know that we appreciate you being here, sharing your knowledge, and we may continue to call on you from time to time to be that resource, because we need help.
Could I say one more thing?
Please, by all means, you're the instructor.
I've said this before, but I believe that if Portsmouth takes on this challenge, you all can be a model for the nation.
That's great.
And in doing so, you can generate jobs in industries where you don't think you have many options, you have many options. Fixing brownfields, that's done by private entities. So companies can actually begin to do that for all of Hampton Roads and beyond, because there are a lot of brownfields.
All over the state.
Yes. And you also have opportunities for cleaning the waterways. And there's a lot of money involved in cleaning the waterways, because we have nothing but industries located on our waterways, and I'm telling you, they are polluting our waterways even today. And so there are opportunities, and I would love for you all to, Portsmouth is one of the oldest cities in America. It didn't have the advantage of planning in advance, like places like Columbia, Maryland. And a lot of cities are like you all. You know, you're older and you simply grew up and cobbled things to yourself.
Trial and error.
But if you create a plan for the future to begin to relocate these public nuisances to areas that would not pollute the environment and not pollute communities, but would be relocated, I believe there are funds available to access that and to do that. And if you do it in a very deliberate way, I believe that the nation's attention will focus on Portsmouth in a very positive way, in a way that helps to facilitate not only this community's healing, but the nation's healing. And so I'm going to shut up for right now. Thank you all so much.
Awesome.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks. And so with that, if I can hand the meeting back over to Mr.
So that was your only presentation for tonight. Excuse me. You have 8 city managers' report for your consideration. City Council, if you want me to go ahead and read through the...
Please.
Okay. All right. 23-300, adoption of an ordinance regarding visibility and clearance at intersections. 23-301, adoption of an ordinance to update the Wetlands Code, City of Portsmouth. 23-302, adoption of an ordinance accepting a grant in the amount of $25,990 for the police department for traffic safety initiatives. Adoption of an ordinance accepting a grant in the amount of $10,000, once again, for the police department to reduce driving under the influence. 23-304, adoption of an ordinance accepting $1,800 from the Virginia Department of Social Services. 23-305, adoption of an ordinance accepting projects for assistance in transition from homelessness in the amount of $3,713. 23-306, there's two items underneath this item. One's a resolution to amend the Articles of Incorporation for the Community Broadband Authority. The other is adoption of an ordinance to amend and reordain Chapter 2, which is the administration portion of the Portsmouth Community Broadband Authority. And then 23-307 is an adoption of a resolution authorizing conveyance of 2 drainage easements for the Simpson flyover along Route 58.
Thank you, sir. Are there any council liaison reports at this time? Councilman Hugel, sir, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. So week 4 last, I had a school board liaison meeting with Dr. Bracy, Mr. Falk, and board member Duncan Hines. 2 important discussions during that liaison meeting. First, the school system has more teacher vacancies in September than they had in May or in June when we broke for the summer. So we net lost teachers across summertime. When we discussed what the superintendent was intended to do about that, he shared that they have initiated a salary survey to take a look at pay compression amongst experienced teachers. And so in our down the road discussions, I hope to get more insight into what that salary survey tells us, what the implications of that are to the school budget in order to decompress the pay amongst experienced teachers. That led into a discussion around the end of fiscal year surplus, and Dr. Bracy shared that at that point, which was before we saw his end of year surplus memo, that they intended to make a significant investment into career and technical education. That was as much information as he was able to provide at that point. We subsequently have seen the memo that he sent to us after the last Thursday school board meeting on where they would like to make that investment. So I think we have some further discussions needed around what that investment's going to look like. That's it, sir. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Any other council liaison reports?
I have one just for.
Vice Mayor.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. The Stop Inc. Board, where I'm the liaison for the city. I guess a question to Ms. White. I don't know if they've advertised that as openings, but they are looking for an A and B member from the city, 2 persons to serve. So would like to add that or open it up for persons who may be interested in serving on Stop Inc. Board.
Is that it, ma'am?
That's it.
Thank you, ma'am. That concludes our council liaison reports. This public work session is adjourned. We will have our regular meeting at 7 o'clock p.m.